The silence in Vientiane is heavy, but it isn't the quiet of peace. It's the stillness of a vacuum. Look at the Lao Kip. Since 2022, this currency hasn't just slipped. It has hemorrhaged half its value against the greenback. In the local markets, vendors frantically rewrite price tags in pencil because the ink from a pen lasts longer than the currency's purchasing power. We are witnessing a sovereign state being hollowed out in real time. Public debt here now screams past 100% of GDP. Most observers categorize this as a tragedy of mismanagement or a series of unfortunate loans. They are wrong. This is the extend and pretend cycle, a deliberate financial architecture where the goal isn't repayment, but permanent leverage. The Lowy Institute describes it as a crisis foretold, but not forewarned. Beijing didn't stumble into this. They pushed a high-speed railway through 400 miles of unforgiving jungle, costing $6 billion, knowing full well the host nation had no internal mechanism to service the interest. History repeats itself with a cruel, mathematical precision. In 1923, the Weimar Republic attempted to print its way out of a debt trap, resulting in citizens hauling wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Today, the mechanism is more sophisticated, but the trap remains identical. Laos is currently the canary in the coal mine for a global maturity wall. According to recent IMF assessments, we are entering a period where emerging market debt to China is so opaque that traditional restructuring is impossible. The blueprint is simple. Lend to the desperate, secure the loan against physical infrastructure, power grids, ports, railways, and wait. When the silent implosion occurs, you don't seize the assets immediately. You wait for the default, then you offer a swap. You trade the debt for sovereignty. In late 2024, the Laos State Power Company ceded majority control of its transmission grid to China Southern Power Grid. That wasn't a business deal. It was a foreclosure on a national scale. Your own bank account isn't as insulated as you think. The FDIC's recent reports on unrealized losses in the U.S. banking system, totaling over $500 billion, hint at a similar fragility. We are living inside a global ledger where the numbers no longer represent value, but chains. Why would a superpower lend to a ghost? Because you don't need the money back when you own the ground the debtor stands on. This isn't a failure of the system. This is the system performing exactly as it was designed. Every flickering light in a Vientiane apartment is a reminder that when you lose control of your energy and your transport, you no longer live in a country. You live in a collateralized asset. In the humid offices of Vientiane, a slogan was born that would eventually become an epitaph. The Battery of Southeast Asia. The pitch was seductive in its simplicity. Laos, a landlocked nation with rugged terrain, would harness the Mekong River and its tributaries to export power to its hungrier neighbors, Thailand and Vietnam. By 2023, this ambition had manifested into 94 power plants, 81 of them hydroelectric, churning out enough juice to light up a continent. But there's a glitch in the math that the Lao government didn't account for, or perhaps was encouraged to ignore. The Lowy Institute's recent audit reveals a staggering reality. Massive overinvestment has created a zombie energy sector. We aren't just talking about a slight surplus. We are talking about $3.9 billion in idled power capacity, roughly a quarter of the entire country's GDP, sitting dormant because the domestic market is too small and the export infrastructure is non-existent. This wasn't a failure of imagination. It was forced absorption. China's heavy hitters, the China Development Bank, CDB, and Exim Bank, didn't just provide loans. They flooded a weak institutional landscape with more capital than it could possibly digest. In 2024, the Namu River Cascade projects, funded by a $1.3 billion syndicated loan from these very banks, hit a wall. The state utility, Électricité du Laos, EDL, couldn't honor its purchase agreements. The power was there, the dams were spinning, but the money was gone. Think of the 19th century canal mania or the British railway bubbles. Investors poured capital into projects with zero regard for actual demand, leading to spectacular crashes that allowed the smart money to pick up the pieces for pennies. The battery plan followed this ancient script. By funding projects that exceeded the local capacity to manage or even use the output, Chinese policy banks ensured a state of permanent financial distress. This brings us to the Wiley Journal's forensic analysis of distress-driven production. When a nation is buried under a debt-to-GDP ratio of 112%, it loses the luxury of strategic planning. It enters a survival mode where it must produce and sell at any price just to satisfy the next interest payment. It's a treadmill designed to snap. In 2025, as household energy bills in Laos doubled, the government was forced into a humiliating debt-for-equity shuffle, handing over the keys to the national grid to China Southern Power Grid. They didn't build a battery, they built a siphon. And as the lights flicker in Vientiane, it's becoming clear that the power isn't flowing to the people. It's flowing directly to the creditors. In the sterile jargon of the International Journal of Finance and Economics, there is a concept that explains why the world's most indebted nations don't just stop when the money runs out. It's called the Wiley Principle of financial distress. Most people assume that when a business or a country faces a cash crunch, they tighten their belts. They cut production, fire staff, and wait for the storm to pass. The reality is far more counterintuitive. When a debtor hits a maturity wall, that moment when billions in loans are due and the bank account is empty, they face what's known as rollover risk. At this junction, the debtor doesn't scale back. Instead, they accelerate. They ramp up production of whatever they can sell, be it copper, electricity, or agricultural commodities, even if they are losing money on every unit produced. They are chasing liquidity at the expense of solvency. This creates what economists call a zombie economy. In Laos, we see this in the energy sector. As of late 2020, the country is locked into a cycle of producing massive amounts of hydroelectric power to sell to Thailand at rock-bottom prices. Why? Because they need the Thai baht, or US dollars, immediately to pay the interest on Chinese loans. They are running the dams at full capacity to pay the interest, while the principal, the actual debt, remains untouched. They are sprinting just to stay in the same place. The Wiley analysis, 1002 IJF 716, proves that this isn't an accident. It is a predictable behavioral shift. When you are drowning in debt, the future doesn't exist. Only the next 30 days matter. Chinese state-owned enterprises, SOEs, like the China Communications Construction Company, understand this math perfectly. They don't mind if a project is unprofitable for the host country, because as long as the host country is in distress, they are forced to keep the lights on and the raw materials flowing. Look at the Dallas Fed's 2025 report on Chinese zombie shares. Within China itself, the share of assets held by these walking dead firms has jumped to 16% of the total economy. This is a contagion, China is exporting its own zombie model to the rest of the world. They provide the capital, create the overcapacity, and then watch as the borrower enters a permanent state of distress-driven production. You aren't just watching a country go bankrupt. You are watching a country being converted into a low-cost utility for a superpower. When a nation can no longer choose to stop production because they owe more than they earn, they have lost the most basic element of freedom: the right to say no. The financial system is designed to keep you in the dark, but history provides the map to escape the trap. If this insight opened your eyes, hit the like button to help us break through the noise. Share this with someone who needs to see the patterns before the next collapse, and subscribe to master the mechanics of wealth that they don't want you to understand. Don't let your purchasing power disappear in silence. Drop a comment below, and let's discuss the truth the 1% ignores. In 2021, the first sleek, emerald green train slid across the border from China into Laos, cutting through 422 kilometers of what used to be impenetrable jungle. This was the crown jewel of the Belt and Road Initiative, the $6 billion Laos-China Railway. On paper, it was a miracle of engineering. In reality, it has become a sovereign anchor, dragging the nation into a depths of debt from which there is no statistical escape. The infrastructure-led growth myth suggests that if you build it, prosperity follows. But the Lowy Institute's most recent forensic data from late 2025 tells a darker story. Even with the railway hitting record passenger numbers and transport revenues in China topping 1 trillion yuan, the benefits for Laos are vanishingly small. The revenue generated by the line barely scratches the surface of the interest payments, let alone the principal. Here is the number that should keep every finance minister in the developing world awake at night: $5.1 billion. That is the amount Laos owes specifically to China, nearly half of its total external debt. While the world watched Sri Lanka and Zambia default, Laos has avoided a formal default only through a series of shadowy, ad hoc deferrals. It is a state of perpetual bankruptcy. The Lowy Institute calls it growing out of the crisis is unrealistic. Even if the railway operates at peak efficiency, the debt is so large that it functions as a transfer of wealth from the Lao taxpayer directly to Beijing. Look at the mechanics of the trap. In late 2025, while the Lao kip stabilized slightly after losing half its value, the country's debt-to-GDP ratio remains a suffocating 118%. When half of your government's revenue goes solely to servicing debt, you don't have a budget for hospitals or schools. You have a collection agency for a foreign power. This isn't just about a train, it's about a strategic corridor. For China, the railway is a vital link to the markets of Southeast Asia, a way to bypass the Malacca Strait. It is a success for Beijing's geopolitical map. But for Laos, it is a $6 billion mortgage on a house they can't afford to heat. History warns us about these strategic anchors. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire built massive railways with European capital. When they couldn't pay, they lost their financial independence to the administration of the Ottoman public debt, a council of foreign creditors that literally collected their taxes for them. Today, we don't call it a council. We call it a bilateral agreement. But when you owe $5.1 billion to a single creditor who owns your rail line and your power grid, the name doesn't matter. The result is the same. You have traded your future for a ticket on a train that isn't taking you anywhere you need to go. In 2020, behind the closed doors of a conference room in Vientiane, a signature was placed on a document that effectively ended the economic independence of the Laos state. This was the birth of Électricité du Laos Transmission Company Limited, EDLT. On the surface, it was presented as a joint venture to modernize the grid. In reality, it was a high-stakes foreclosure. The state utility, Électricité du Laos, EDL, drowning in over $5 billion of debt it could never repay, handed the keys of the national power grid to China Southern Power Grid, CSG. By January 2026, the full scope of this debt-for-equity stealth has become impossible to ignore. CSG doesn't just hold a seat at the table. They own 90% of the company that controls every kilowatt moving through the Lao backbone. This is the blueprint in its purest form. When a debtor's cash runs out, the assets change hands. It isn't just theory. It is the physical realization of a hierarchical creditor-debtor relationship. The Lowy Institute's 2025 analysis is blunt. China and Laos have settled into a relationship underpinned by the logic of power and economic insecurity. Laos built this grid with borrowed Chinese money, used Chinese contractors to string the wires, and now, those same wires belong to a Chinese state-owned firm. The forensic details are chilling. In late 2025, while the Lao government touted a stabilizing economy, they were simultaneously signing away the Thavieng Mahaksai power transmission project to this same joint venture. This isn't development assistance. It is the systematic conversion of a sovereign nation's infrastructure into collateral. As the World Bank and IMF watch from the sidelines, unable to intervene because of the total opacity of these bilateral deals, the Lao people are finding that their battery of Asia aspirations have been repurposed. The Wiley Principle we discussed earlier dictates that a distressed debtor must keep producing to service the debt. But in Scene 5, we see the evolution. When even zombie production isn't enough to cover the interest, the creditor moves from the ledger to the land. By controlling the grid, China now controls the on-off switch for the entire Lao economy. If you want to export power to Thailand or Vietnam, you use a Chinese-owned grid. If you want to light your own capital city, you pay a company 90% owned by Beijing. This is the ultimate trap. You don't need to fire a single shot to conquer a country if you own the utility that keeps its heart beating. As of early 2026, the sovereign in the Sovereign Democratic Republic of Laos has become a legal fiction. The reality is a managed asset on a Chinese balance sheet. When the numbers on a balance sheet stop working, the people start bleeding. In Vientiane, the silent implosion is no longer silent. It's the sound of a woman in a wet market counting out a stack of 100,000 kip notes for a bag of rice that cost half as much 2 years ago. Since the start of 2022, the Lao kip has disintegrated, losing 50% of its value against the dollar. By early 2026, while official inflation figures have supposedly moderated to 7.7%, the damage to the human psyche is permanent. This is the human face of the extend and pretend doctrine. When a nation's debt is denominated in foreign currency, a collapsing exchange rate isn't just a financial hiccup, it's a social guillotine. Enter the People's Bank of China, PBOC, with their RMB $6 billion, roughly $900 million currency swap line. On paper, it looks like a lifeline. In reality, it's a high-interest bandage on a severed artery. This swap line allows Laos to access Chinese yuan to facilitate trade and defend its currency, but it comes with a catch. The Lowy Institute notes that this doesn't reduce debt. It simply replaces one form of liability with another, deeper dependency. It ensures that Laos can continue to buy Chinese goods while its own citizens' savings evaporate. It is a short-term fix that cements a long-term trap. The social cost is a mass exodus. In the first half of 2025 alone, Lao migrant workers sent home $396 million in remittances, a desperate injection of foreign cash that accounts for more than the country's entire education budget. Over 350,000 Lao citizens have fled across the border to Thailand, Japan, and South Korea, not for adventure, but for survival. They are leaving behind a zombie economy, where real wages have been cannibalized by price hikes in medicine and fuel. The World Bank's 2025 assessments are grim. The middle class is being systematically erased. Families who once hoped for university for their children are now pulling them out of school to work in the fields or the factories, trying to outrun a cost of living that moves faster than they can work. Why does this matter to you? Because the swap line strategy is being test-run here before it goes global. It's a mechanism that allows a creditor to maintain a stable facade while the underlying population is hollowed out. It's a world where the currency in your pocket is just a temporary voucher, and the stability of the system is bought with the future of your children. In Laos, the lost decade isn't a prediction anymore. It's the daily reality for 7 million people who found out too late that when a superpower offers to swap your problems, they usually end up owning your solutions. The vibe: clinical, high stakes, and ominous. The narrator is walking through a cavernous, empty boardroom in Beijing. The lighting is cold, surgical. We cut to rapid-fire clips of G20 summits and the blue and white logos of the IMF. The narrator stops at the head of a long mahogany table, looking directly into the lens. In the world of international finance, there is a polite, professional way to admit a project has failed. It's called a haircut. When a country can't pay its bills, the Paris Club, the old guard Western lenders, usually sits down and negotiates a debt write-off. They take a loss, the debtor gets a fresh start, and the world moves on. It's painful for the lender, but it clears the ledger. But as we sit here in 2026, it is clear that Beijing doesn't believe in fresh starts. They believe in the doctrine of deferral. Unlike a traditional bank that forecloses when you miss a payment, China has mastered the art of extend and pretend. Since 2022, they have deferred billions in payments for Laos. On the evening news, this is framed as generous assistance. In reality, it is a strategic leash. By pushing payment deadlines further into the future rather than forgiving the principal, Beijing keeps the Lao government in a state of permanent financial suspended animation. The debt doesn't evaporate, it compounds. It sits on the books like a ticking clock that only the creditor knows how to pause. This deferral serves a calculated dual purpose. First, it prevents Laos from seeking an IMF bailout. An IMF program is the ultimate nightmare for an opaque lender because it requires transparency. The IMF doesn't hand out cash until they've seen the fine print of every secret bilateral agreement signed in the dark. Beijing cannot allow those contracts to see the light of day. To do so would expose the China model, the idea of state-funded prosperity, as a high-interest mortgage on national sovereignty. Second, it protects the brand. If China were to grant a massive debt haircut to Laos, it would be an official admission that their infrastructure-led growth model has failed. More dangerously, it would set a precedent. If Laos gets a 50% discount on its debt, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Ethiopia will be at the door by morning. The Lowy Institute's 2025 analysis is blunt. China has transitioned from being the world's banker to being its most aggressive debt collector. While the rest of the world talks about development, China is focused on liquidity. In 2025 alone, the world's poorest nations paid a record $22 billion back to Beijing. For Laos, this means more than half of all domestic revenue is sucked out of the country before a single teacher is paid or a single road is paved. This is the creation of a hierarchical creditor-debtor relationship. Sovereignty is now the interest payment. By refusing to write off the debt, China maintains a community of shared destiny where they hold the master key. This isn't a temporary rough patch for Laos. It's a permanent restructuring of what it means to be a nation-state. In this new world order, you don't default and start over. You just extend your debt and pretend you're still in charge, while the creditor slowly merges your national assets into their own balance sheet. The vibe: high stakes, investigative, and claustrophobic. The narrator stands in a dim, cavernous room filled with stacks of dusty paper ledgers and flickering computer monitors. The background noise is a low, industrial hum mixed with the distant sound of construction sirens. If this blueprint is so efficient, why does the architect look so terrified? To understand why Beijing refuses to grant Laos even a fraction of debt relief, you have to look past the Mekong and deep into the bleeding balance sheets of the Chinese mainland. China isn't acting from a position of absolute strength. It is acting from a position of systemic entrapment. By early 2026, the People's Bank of China, PBOC, is no longer just a lender of last resort. It's a janitor cleaning up a domestic property crisis that has vaporized trillions in household wealth. Within China, the zombie phenomenon we saw in Laos is a mirror image of their own internal stressors. Recent Bank for International Settlements, BIS data, suggests that China's total debt-to-GDP ratio has surged toward 300%. The economic miracle is currently being held together by emergency liquidity injections and sheer political willpower. Here is the forensic reality. Chinese policy banks like the Exim Bank and the China Development Bank cannot afford to forgive the $5.1 billion owed by Laos. Why? Because their own capital buffers are under siege. As the property giants Evergrande and Country Garden collapsed, they left a hole in the Chinese banking system that makes Western subprime look like a rounding error. If Beijing takes a haircut on a foreign loan today, it triggers a chain reaction. It signals to every other struggling BRI nation, from Pakistan to Kenya, that the bank is open for negotiations, and that is a run on the bank Beijing cannot survive. The Wiley Principle applies here on a gargantuan scale. Just as the Laos state utility is forced to pump energy at a loss to service debt, Chinese state-owned enterprises are forced to continue building infrastructure abroad to absorb their own massive industrial overcapacity. They are exporting their zombie problem to keep their own factories running and their own workers from rioting. This is a forced march of capital. History shows us that when a central power faces a domestic collapse, it becomes more predatory toward its peripheries, not less. Think of the late Roman Empire debasing the denarius to pay for border walls, or the Spanish crown extracting every ounce of silver from the Americas to cover interest on loans from Genoese bankers. Today, the silver is infrastructure. In 2025, a record $22 billion in debt repayments flowed from the world's poorest nations back to Beijing. The Lowy Institute is clear. For the rest of this decade, China will be a debt collector first and a developer second. The global collapse isn't a future event. It's the sound of a superpower trying to outrun its own shadow by pulling the rest of the world down with it. They won't let Laos go because they are clinging to the same ledge, the vibe, high velocity, global, and connective. The narrator stands before a floor-to-ceiling digital map of the world. Pins drop on the screen with a heavy metallic thud, pulsing red across the global south, from the mountains of Montenegro to the coastlines of Kenya and the plains of Pakistan. Laos was never an isolated tragedy. It was the laboratory for a global realignment of power. By 2026, the Lao model has become the standard operating procedure for a superpower transitioning from the world's banker to its most relentless debt collector. We are witnessing a tidal wave of repayments. According to the Lowy Institute's 2025 data, 75 of the world's most vulnerable nations are currently making record-high payments to Beijing, totaling over $22 billion this year alone. Take a look at Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, was sold as a $60 billion shortcut to prosperity. By 2026, it has become a sovereign anchor. Just like in Vientiane, the infrastructure is magnificent. Towering coal plants and the deep-water port of Gwadar, but the revenue is a ghost. Pakistan is now locked in a cycle of emergency rescue loans from Beijing just to pay back the interest on previous Chinese loans. It is the ultimate zombie cycle, where the debtor's only function is to keep the cash flowing back to the creditor. Then there is Montenegro. They borrowed $1 billion for a highway that cost nearly 25% of their entire GDP, a road to a mountain tunnel that led nowhere for years. When they couldn't pay, they didn't just face a financial crisis. They faced an existential one. Their contract, much like the ones in Laos, allowed the creditor to seize land in the event of default. This isn't a partnership anymore. It is asset management on a planetary scale. The global collapse isn't a sudden market crash. It is the slow, agonizing erosion of sovereign independence. In 54 countries today, debt payments to China now exceed the combined payments owed to the entire Paris Club of Western nations. The Lowy Institute is clear. China has successfully bypassed the international financial architecture. They've built their own gated community of debt, where the IMF has no keys and the rules are written in the dark. This is the synthesis of the blueprint. By over-leveraging the global south with non-productive infrastructure, Beijing has created a maturity wall that is hitting right now in the mid-2020s. When a nation can no longer fund its own hospitals because its tax revenue is diverted to a policy bank in Shanghai, that nation has ceased to be sovereign. It has become a managed asset. We are seeing the transition from the big push of the 2010s to the foreclosure phase of the 2020s. The goal was never to get the money back. The goal was to ensure that when the money wasn't there, the power remained. From the ports of Djibouti to the power grids of Laos, the map is being redrawn, not by generals, but by accountants. The vibe. The narrator is standing on a high ridge overlooking the Mekong River at twilight. The water is a deep, bruised purple. Behind them, the lights of a Chinese-funded special economic zone flicker on. A city within a city where local laws are secondary to the creditor's interests. The tone is somber, authoritative, and final. We started this investigation by asking why a superpower would lend billions to a nation that had no mathematical way to pay it back. We looked for a blunder, a miscalculation, a series of unfortunate events. But as the sun sets over Vientiane, the truth is much colder. There was no mistake. The failure of the debt was the ultimate design feature. The Lowy Institute calls it a lost decade. For the 7 million people of Laos, that isn't just an economic forecast. It's a life sentence of hard labor. It's a reality where every kilowatt of power generated by their rivers and every bag of rice sold in their markets is already spoken for by a bank in Beijing before the citizen even touches the cash. By early 2026, the data is undeniable. Growth is a ghost, and sovereignty is a legal fiction. But don't make the mistake of thinking this is a remote tragedy. The debt trap blueprint is a mirror. We are currently standing in front of a global maturity wall. In 2026, trillions of dollars in debt are coming due across the developing world. From Pakistan to Montenegro to Kenya, the exit doors are being locked one by one. And the extend and pretend strategy we've dissected, that isn't just for the global south. Look at the FDIC reports from late 2025. Look at the $517 billion in unrealized losses sitting on the books of the banks in your own neighborhood. We are living in an era where the smart money has stopped betting on production and started betting on asset management. They don't want your profit. They want your collateral. They want the grid, the port, the rail, and the land. The blueprint worked. It guaranteed a global collapse not by breaking the system, but by perfecting it. It turned sovereign nations into managed assets on a foreign balance sheet. As the lights flicker in a Vientiane apartment tonight, remember the math we uncovered. The most expensive money in the world is the loan you're told you don't have to pay back today. Because when tomorrow finally comes, they won't ask for your currency. They'll just take the ground you're standing on.